Welcome back. I'd like to carry over and further develop some of the principles that I discussed in the previous session. That session focused on the first 3 chapters of Breshit, the book of Genesis. This session is going to focus on a single psalm from the book of Tehillim, from the book of Psalms, on Psalm chapter 22. For some of you from the Jewish tradition, this is not a very well-known psalm. From the Christian tradition, this is one of the best-known psalms of all. I love this picture from the Rothschild miscellany, attributing psalms to David, as it is in Jewish and Christian tradition, and viewing David playing in this most pastoral scene on his harp, I imagine accompanying the recitation of the book of Psalms. Before I talk about Psalm chapter 22, I just want to say a few words about the larger book that it is a part of, namely the book of Psalms. For more details about this, please take a look at my chapter on the book of Psalms in my book, How to Read the Jewish Bible. Psalms has 150 chapters. It's really all over the place. And I define the book of Psalms, or describe the book of Psalms there, as a non-haphazard collection. In other words, it is somewhat ordered. It's actually a collection of collections, because within the book itself, there are some very clear collections. The most obvious of them is toward the last third or quarter of the book, the Shir HaMa'alot, the Song of Ascent collections. But there are other collections as well. For example, the last handful of Psalms begin and end with the word hallelujah. So they are a type of hallelujah collection. And something that characterizes the book of Psalms is not merely that these are prayers, but these are prayers in poetry. I'll talk about that in the following slide a little bit. And there are all sorts of different types of prayers. Some of them are songs of thanksgiving. Some of them are hymns. Some of them are laments or petitions. Some of them are didactic psalms. So again, they're of different genres. The book, even though it is traditionally attributed to David, although not uniformly in Jewish and Christian tradition, they're in different places. Some were written in Israel. Some were probably written during the Babylonian exile. They were written in different times. I don't know if any are as early as King David, but some are from First Temple times, some are from Second Temple times, some are from the Babylonian exile, and Psalms share many qualities with ancient Near Eastern prayers. So keep this in mind when we look at a single psalm, namely Psalm 22. As I said a moment ago, all of the Psalms are in poetry. So here I'm going to be a little bit tautological as I describe what biblical poetry looks like. I'm simply going to say to begin with that poetry is that which is not prose, and that most languages have special linguistic registers, a special way of speaking, which is different than prose. So if I were to suddenly move into rhymed, balanced verse, you would think I'm very strange, because I'm not giving this lecture in prose. And in English, one of the main ways that poetry is expressed is through meter, namely a set of balanced, stressed and unstressed syllables, and different times in English poetry, rhyme. Biblical poetry may or may not have meter. That is something which is debated. It certainly does not have rhyme. But the main characteristic of biblical poetry, which is really first described well in the 18th century by Bishop Robert Loth, who was a bishop of Oxford and professor of poetry at Oxford University. He dealt with Greek and Latin poetry as well. And he defined biblical poetry as characterized by something that is called parallelism, a type of binariness, where, as later people will describe it, you have a verse which can be divided into two parts, sometimes into three parts, but where there are various types of relations or connections between the first and the second part, and this can often be described as A and what is more so B. Loth described three main types of parallelism. The first, and these are all illustrations either from Psalms or from Proverbs, all of which are in poetry, synonymous parallelism, where the second part of the verse, the B part, says the first part again in slightly different words. Yoshev b'shamayim yischak, Adonai yil'ag lamo. He who is enthroned in heaven laughs, the Lord mocks at them. See my color coding. He who is enthroned in heaven in yellow and the Lord are identical. Laughs and mocks are very similar. And at them, this is very typical of biblical verses, not everything is repeated exactly. Sometimes you'll have something in one part that is not present in the other. That's synonymous parallelism. I use Proverbs 15:20 as an example of antithetical parallelism. Ben chacham yisamachav, uchsil adam bozeh imo. A wise son makes father happy. A fool of a man humiliates his mother. Note the his in white, that is not reflected in the first part of the verse, but you have the opposites of wise and fool, and the opposites of father and mother, and the opposites of make happy and humiliates, even though they're not precisely opposites. Third type of parallelism, noted by Loth, this is a category which is perhaps a bit of a catch-all and therefore not a totally satisfactory category, is synthetic. I bring an example from the most famous psalm, Adonai ro'i, lo echsar. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. Please note I can't color code this because there are not words which are either the same, synonymous, or antithetical opposites in the two halves of the verse. And if you'd like to read more about this and the theories, different theories that explain this, from the 1980s, there are two very, very good books which talk about this. One by James Kugel, who now lives across the street from me in Jerusalem, The Idea of Biblical Poetry. The other by the famous professor of literature from the University of California at Berkeley, The Art of Biblical Poetry. And again, these suggest that these verses need to be read as A and what is more so B. So with that in mind, we can now come to chapter 22 of the book of Psalms. What I would really love for you to do, if it is possible, is to read the psalm several times to yourselves, or perhaps out loud, before seeing my treatment of it. There are many websites where the psalm is available. The website Sefaria, S-E-F-A-R-I-A, has Jewish translations of the psalm, including the New Jewish Publication Society translation. There is a Christian site called Bible Gateway, that's one word, which offers many Christian translations of the psalm. And what would really be wonderful is if you could read both a Jewish and a Christian translation. You can start comparing them to each other, and you can think about several questions which people typically ask about psalms. How would you divide the psalm into sections? Where would you put white spaces or paragraph markers? Again, compare the different translations. What makes a psalm poetic, and what difficulties does it present? If you have the opportunity, please read the psalm, think about these issues, and then turn to the next slide. Psalm 22 is very vivid poetry. It has many metaphors, more than I can easily count. Its imagery is very exaggerated, especially the way in which it uses different animals. I hope the introduction that I offered a few moments ago is helpful in terms of understanding the binariness. Most of the verses are bicola. They have two parts. A small number are tricola. And parallelism is very, very strong in the psalm. So here I just give you three examples. Elohai ekra yomam v'lo ya'aneh, v'layla v'lo dumia li. My God, that's outside of the parallelistic structure. I cry by day, you answer not. Then the opposite, by night, I have no respite. So some sort of antithetical parallelism here. Or describing God. B'cha batchu avotenu, batchu vatafaltemo. In you our fathers trusted, they trusted, you rescued them. You can't be any more synonymous than repeating the very same root batach in the A part and in the B part. Or verse 19, Yichalaku vigdai lahem v'alvushi yapilu goral. They divide my clothes among themselves, casting lots for my garments. The translation says garments, really garment in the singular, would be better in this particular case. Let me talk about the structure of the psalm. It very neatly divides into three parts after its introduction. Biblical scholars call these introductions superscriptions. They often note how the psalm was to be developed musically. We often do not understand these superscriptions. In this case, for the leader, on Ayelet HaShachar, a psalm of David. Then, quite typically in the Bible, it has a section which is demarcated by having the same word at the beginning and the end. In this case, the Hebrew word rachak, to be far or distant, begins verse 2 and ends in verse 12. The second section, the middle section, is characterized by wild animals. And if you look at the order of these animals, they appear in ABC at the beginning of the psalm, CBA at the end of the psalm. This is a frequent biblical structure called a chiasm. The last unit, beginning in verse 23, moves from the individual who is suffering to lessons that the entire community and eventually all nations should learn. This psalm is categorized by biblical scholars as either a lament or a petition of the individual. There are two main axes around which psalms can be defined. One of them is the axis of the individual or the community. Here the speaker is an I, so thus it is a psalm of the individual, and certain psalms are optimistic, others are pessimistic. This is certainly a pessimistic one, where the psalmist is asking to be saved, and thus it would be called a lament or a petition. These laments have a very typical structure. After I show this to you in Psalm 22, perhaps you might want to look at Psalm 6 or Psalm 13. Psalm 6 is used in the Jewish liturgy of Tachanun. It is used within the Christian liturgy. It is often recited there as well. And these psalms have a very particular structure. They begin with an invocation of God. Thus, our psalm begins, Eli, Eli, my God, our God. It then, given that it's a petition, you have to explain or lament, like what's wrong. Oh, there's a lot wrong in this particular psalm. The psalmist feels abandoned. He compares himself to a worm. He talks about all the wild animals that are surrounding him, dogs, lions, wild oxen, others. So, is he really in the middle of a jungle, or is all this metaphorical? He talks about how fearful he is. He's thirsty, he's parched. His clothes are taken from him. He is stripped naked. Well, if you're going to have a petition, you need to call to God. And as I note, every time I say this, I'm surprised. The psalmist is very comfortable talking to God in the imperative. So, al tirchak mimeni in verse 12. Do not be far from me. There's no please here in the Hebrew, whether in verse 12 or verses 21 and 22. The psalmist offers reasons why God should listen. God was nice to his ancestors. God should feel sorry for the psalmist. And this surprises quite a few people. The psalm assumes that God likes to hear his praise. And thus the psalmist says, listen, be nice to me. Yeah, the same thing in Psalm 6. Don't kill me, and I will praise you. Finally, a big part of the structure of these psalms is the psalmist himself is confident that he has been heard. Thus, the end of verse 25, he did not hide his face from him. When he cried out to him, he listened. This is called the certainty of hearing. And many of these features of this particular genre were isolated by the very important German scholar Hermann Gunkel, who is active at the end of the 19th and the 20th century, and is best known for the form criticism of psalms, for dividing psalms into various genres. From the psalm itself, we have no idea who the psalmist is, and as I noted a moment ago, if various problems that are noted are literal or are metaphorical. This psalm has quite a few difficulties in the Hebrew itself. I'm only going to note two of them. The first one is in the third part of verse 17. I'll read the Hebrew and I'll read it to you in three different translations and explain to you why these different translations exist. The Hebrew, ka'ari yadai v'raglai. JPS, very literal translation, but they have to put something in square brackets. Like lions, ka'ari, they maul, that is not in the Hebrew. My hands and feet, that is in the Hebrew. Yadai v'raglai. Please note that the word like lions is understood as a verb in the next three translations that we are going to look at. King James, they pierced my hands, etc. New Revised Standard Version, they bound my hands. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation. And here it is important to realize that all the New Testament authors were reading the Hebrew Bible, or more properly the Old Testament, in Greek. Here, the translation of the Septuagint into Greek, itself translated into English, says, they gouged my hands and feet. So here you could see the King James and the Septuagint are similar. The New Revised Standard Version, instead of reading the noun like a lion, reads a verb. This has to do with a slight emendation of the text. And you could really ask, I'm not going to deal with this at all in this sort of session, what's preferable? Adding some words that are not present in the text in square brackets, or reading the text slightly differently. Second problem in the Hebrew. Verse 22, deliver me from a lion's mouth, from the horns of wild oxen rescue me. The word for wild oxen in Hebrew is remim. And it is possible, and that's how the JPS translation is rendering it, that this is an exceptional plural of the Hebrew word re'im, even though the plural of re'im should really be re'emim rather than re'mim. But there are ways to explain why this particular form would exist in the plural. So thus is the translation wild oxen really correct. However, please note that the Septuagint, again, LXX is the standard abbreviation for Septuagint, the translation, according to tradition, by 70 or 72 sages, renders this verse, "Save me from a lion's mouth, and my lowliness from the horns of unicorns." Again, Remim is understood as unicorns, and you could see from that Greek word, the beginning of it is mano, that refers to one, animals that have one horn. So if anybody ever asks you where there are unicorns in the Bible, you now know that they may be found in Psalm 22. So before I move on to this psalm in Christian and Jewish tradition, let me make a few points. It's a rather typical ho-hum lament or petition of the individual. We do not know, going to the third bullet point, who recited it. Many people who are in many different straits or forms of distress would be able to recite it because it is unclear which of the problems that you have here are metaphorical and which are literal. I now turn to this issue of the I in the Psalms and would note that in Jewish literature, there are two main options for who the I of the psalmist is. In most cases, the I is understood as King David. About half of the Psalms are attributed explicitly to David. The other half, according to the predominant Jewish tradition, were recited by him, even if his name does not appear explicitly in the superscription. There's another option for the I. This is going to be important for this week and for next week as well when we talk about, for next session as well, when we talk about Isaiah, that very often Israel as a group, Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, is expressed in both psalm and prophetic literature using the individual I. So those are the two main options. Christian literature focuses on Jesus, and therefore, within Christian interpretations of many psalms, the I is Jesus. That is true of the interpretation of Psalm 22 as well. Unless you say, this is absurd and ridiculous, how can Christianity do that? I would point out that the same thing is done in Judaism as well. In medieval Jewish tradition, some of the Psalms are understood as prophetic, and in the Dead Sea Scroll literature, the book of Psalms is understood as fundamentally prophetic. So this notion of the Psalms as prophecy exists to some extent within Judaism, but is very central within Christianity. When Jews understand Psalms as prophetic, they are not going to understand them as referring to Jesus, while Christians will typically understand these Psalms as talking about various aspects of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I now move to the Christian interpretation of Psalm 22. And within the New Testament, there are many, many references, both allusions and echoes and explicit references to Psalm chapter 22. So let me start with the Gospels. Again, the earliest Gospel, according to scholars, the Gospel of Marc, where at 3 o'clock Jesus cried out with a loud voice. And this is Aramaic transliterated into Greek, in Greek letters. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? You can see Matthew has a similar quote. It's in a more Hebrew form, Eli, Eli, rather than Eloi, Eloi. And the Hebrew, as I have on top, is Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. Luke and John have different last words for the crucified Jesus. Another set of allusions concerns the clothes that were distributed of Jesus. Again, that is why when I talked about biblical parallelism, I chose that particular verse. Please note in Mark. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. An exact reference to what you have in Psalm 22. Note in Matthew, and this is very typical of Matthew, that you have a little addition. They divided my clothes among themselves. And I'm sorry, let me start all over again for Matthew 27:35. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. And there's a little note that some manuscripts or ancient authorities add the words, in order that what had been spoken through the prophet may be fulfilled. Here the prophet is David, and this type of statement that has the words might be fulfilled is called a citation fulfillment formula. This very much typifies the Gospel of Matthew. In Luke, you similarly have, then Jesus said, the first part of this verse is not present in all of the versions, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing, and they cast lots to divide his clothing. John is especially significant. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, and I remind you, John is not a synoptic gospel. What you have here where John differs a little or a lot from the other three gospels is rather typical. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it. That was to fulfill what the scripture says. They divided my clothes among them. Those are the clothes of the first part of the verse divided into 4 parts. But then, and for my clothing, that's the second part, the tunic, they cast lots. The gospel, the author of the Gospel of John, is not understanding the verse as fully parallel and referring to 2 identical things, but is understanding it in 2 different ways. Over part of his clothing, which had seams and therefore could easily be ripped apart, they divided it, and for his tunic, which was made of a single piece, they did not want to cut it, and over that they cast lots. This is a type of superfine reading of the biblical verse, which may be familiar to some of you from rabbinic literature. And yes, you did not mishear me. I am saying that here the Gospel of John is reading the verse from Psalm 22 super closely in a way which might be similar to the manner in which the rabbis would read the verse. Other aspects of Psalm 22 that you see in the Gospels, in Mark and in Matthew, the fact that the psalmist is being mocked or derided is reflected. Those who passed him derided him, that you have in both of these Gospels. And by the way, those of you who do not know the New Testament well may be surprised that Mark and Matthew are so similar. There is a general consensus among New Testament scholars that one of the main sources of the Gospel of Matthew was the Gospel of Mark. Finally, one of the elements that you have in Psalm 22, you can see at the very bottom of this slide, my mouth is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue sticks to my jaws. Here, this detail is given narrative life in the Gospel of John. And here, this is unique to John. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, I am thirsty. So here you have a whole set of clear references in Psalm 22 that are applied explicitly to Jesus. So to summarize this, the different authors of the Gospels reflected in the earliest Christ-believing community. And here I'm being very specific and careful with my language. There is a very significant discussion which has developed in particular over the last few decades over what is called the parting of the ways, which deals with the question, at what point is it appropriate to talk of Christians as a group which is totally distinct from Jews? The New Testament uses the equivalent Greek term to Christians fewer than 5 times, and in the period in the first century of the Common Era, Christians did not really exist as a separate religious group, but existed as a group of what I call, following other scholars here, the Christ-believing Jewish community. So thus I say, the earliest Christ-believing Jewish community who had Psalm 22 as part of their scripture understood Psalm 22 as prophetic, with David as a prophet referring to Jesus, and thus they applied many verses in Psalms to Jesus. And this tendency, as we'll see in the next slide, continued throughout early Christianity. So here, this is a work by Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr lived from about the year 100 to the year 165, obviously of the Common Era, because he is an important early Christian figure. There is an important work preserved called Justin's Dialogue with Trypho. This deals with a 2-day dialogue between Justin, a Jewish Christ believer, and Trypho, who is Jewish but not a Christ believer, where they're differing in their interpretation of Psalm 22 and many other issues. This is a description of a debate which took place over 2 days. Many earlier scholars connected Trypho with the rabbinic sage Rabbi Tarfon. This is actually quite unlikely. So here I go to the dialogue. David in the 21st Psalm, I need not go into that. The numbering of Psalms is different in the Septuagint and the Hebrew, thus refers to the suffering and to the cross in a parable of mystery. They pierced, note the Septuagint reading, my hands and my feet. They counted all my bones. They considered and gazed on me. They parted my garments among themselves and cast lots upon my vesture. For when they crucified him, driving in the nails, they pierced his hands and his feet. And those who crucified him parted his garments among themselves, each casting lots for what he chose to have, and having received according to the decision of the lot. And this very psalm, Justin is saying to the Jewish Trypho, you maintain does not refer to Christ, for you are in all respects blind and do not understand that no one in your nation who has been called king or Christ has ever had his hands or feet pierced while alive or has died in this mysterious fashion, to wit, by the cross, save this Jesus alone. In other words, Trypho is being spoken to by Justin, and Justin is saying very polemically, just read Psalm 22. Is it not obvious that it must be referring to Jesus? Well, the Jewish position is that it is not referring to Jesus. And here I actually need to correct myself. A moment ago I said the Jewish position. I really need to speak about Jewish positions. And here I'm going to talk about 3 different Jewish positions. Now again, we do not know what the Jewish interpretation of Psalm 22 was in the 1st and 2nd centuries. All we do know, and this is a bit of a tautology, that the Jewish non-Christ believers did not understand Psalm 22 in relation to Jesus. So how might it be understood? We really can't be positive because we do not have a lot of Jewish literature from the 1st century and the 2nd century of the Common Era. And indeed, one of the reasons the New Testament is so important for the Jewish community, or should be so important for the Jewish community, is it offers very important glimpses into aspects of Jewish life in the 1st and perhaps the early 2nd century of the Common Era. So here is the first Jewish position that I would like to talk about. This is from Midrash Psalms. In its final form, this Midrash is likely much later than the origin of Christianity. It's from the 8th century, but this is just such a wonderful Midrash, even though it's later. I cannot resist sharing it with you. This Midrash states, while David was tending sheep, he came upon the Re'im. Remember, that's our unicorn, asleep in the wilderness. And David thought it was a mountain. So he climbed upon it and continued to tend his sheep. Be very careful mountain climbing. The Midrash continues. The Re'im, waking up, arose, and David, astride of its horns, was lifted up as high as the heavens. Oh my gosh, David was truly frightened. At that moment, David said, Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe, if you bring me down from the horns of the Re'im, I will build your temple. In other words, this is connecting David, the Psalm 22, and David's wish to build the temple, which of course was fulfilled only by his son Solomon, but the Bible does talk about David's desire to build the temple. So David says he wants to build the temple. What did God, blessed be he, do for David? Because David is stuck up there, far from the earth, on the horns of this Re'im. God caused the lion, go back to Psalm 22, to come toward the Re'im. And when this unicorn saw the lion, he was afraid and cringed before it. So therefore, the Re'im lowered David. And it continues, when David saw the lion, he also was afraid of it, which explains why the psalmist, whom this Midrash's understanding as being David, is saying, save me from the lion. Another Jewish position. This one is found, I mentioned him already in our previous session, in the greatest of the medieval traditional Jewish commentators, Rashi. Again, I remind you, French, 1040 to 1105. Rashi has a verse-by-verse interpretation of the psalm, and I remind you that the superscription of the psalm is for the leader on, or played to the music of the dawn of the deer, a psalm of David. So Rashi, explicating the words of the superscription, the dawn of the deer, says, this refers to the congregation of Israel. But why would the congregation of Israel be called a deer? Because in Proverbs chapter 5, verse 19, Israel is called a loving doe, and following the rabbinic interpretation of the Song of Songs as an allegory about the love between Israel and God, it is said of that doe that shines through like the dawn. So in other words, Rashi, working with the superscription and the book of Proverbs and the book of the Song of Songs, and assuming that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is one uniform composition, says the deer of the dawn in verse 1 By the way, in the English versions, that would be verse 0. The deer of the dawn is referring to Israel. Well, how does the rest of the psalm fit into Israel? Verse 14, for example, speaks of a roaring lion. Who is that roaring lion? According to Rashi, it is King Nebuchadnezzar, the king who destroyed the temple in the year 586, destroyed the first temple, and brought many Israelites to exile to Babylonia. Well, what about verse 7, which speaks of a worm? Rashi says that this worm in the singular refers, quote, to Israel metaphorically as one person. So here you see how Israel is understood, not David, is understood as the referent of the psalm. This is a traditional way of understanding the psalm among the medieval commentators. And so Rabbi David Kimchi Radak, who was born around 1160 and died in 1235, follows Rashi and says the psalm, is in the singular, but certainly not about Jesus, concerning the entire nation of Israel together, for they are like one person in exile with one heart. So that's the second position. Here is the third position. This comes from another midrash, another type of rabbinic interpretive literature called Pesik Tarabati. This midrash was lost for a long time in the medieval period. It was rediscovered, and this midrash has many features which are very eccentric. One of those features is it has two messiahs. The first Messiah, who is not from David, but is a descendant of Joseph, is called in this midrashic corpus and elsewhere in midrashic literature the Messiah from Ephraim, or the Messiah Ephraim. So this text reads, during the week, during a particular 7-year period, when the Messiah of Ephraim comes, they will bring iron beams and they will put them on the neck until the Messiah's body is bent. He will scream and weep, and his voice will rise up to the height of heaven. He will say in his presence, in God's presence, Master of the universe, how much can my limbs endure? How much my spirit? Am I not but flesh and blood? It was this moment that David lamented, saying, my strength is dried up like a potsherd. Whoa. This midrash, Pesik Tarabati, is understanding Psalm 22 as referring to the Messiah, but not really the Messiah, the precursor Messiah, the Messiah Ephraim, and is applying these verses, which the New Testament would apply to Jesus, to the Ephraim of Messiah. So it is relevant to note that both Jewish and Christian tradition, Jewish tradition in a minority tradition, Christian tradition as a majority tradition, apply Psalm 22 to a messianic figure. And please note how all three of these Jewish readings may polemicize against the Christian reading, the Christological reading of Psalm 22, namely reading the psalm in reference to Jesus. Here's a further polemic. In Jewish tradition, and this is true in some Jewish communities till this very day, the words of the psalmist in Psalm 22 are applied to Esther. This is found, for example, in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Megillah, where it says, the verse says with regard to Esther, and she stood in the inner court of the king's house, Rabbi Levi said, once she reached the chamber of the idols, where the idols were in the presence of the royal palace and the inner court, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, which she had with her, which was going to give her the strength to confront King Ahasuerus, it left her. She immediately said, opening of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then she's guessing, well, maybe God, why did you leave me? Because perhaps it is because you judge an action done to circumstances beyond one's control as one done willingly. In other words, maybe God, you're judging me for something I did involuntarily. Or perhaps you have left me because in my prayer I called Haman a dog. As it is stated in Psalm 22, deliver my soul from the sword, my only one from the hand of the dog. So therefore, she retracted and called him again. We're going to quote our psalm in her prayers, a lion. She called Haman a lion, as it is stated in the following verse, save me from the lion's mouth. So this is not recited by Jesus on the cross, according to the Babylonian Talmud here. It is recited by Queen Esther. And of course, it is hard to imagine a moment that is more the opposite than Jesus on the cross than the festival of Purim. So this is an inversion which is clearly making fun of the very serious Christian use of Psalm 22 by claiming, no, instead this psalm belongs not to Jesus, but to Esther, and is part of frivolity rather than the core event of Christian belief. So here you see how Psalm 22 changes so radically, both within Judaism and between Judaism and Christianity. This is a wonderful, relatively recent book by a scholar who teaches at Hebrew Union College, A Life of Psalms in Jewish Late Antiquity. And there, A.J. Berkowitz says, Psalm 22 provided a colorful palette with which ancient Jews and early Christians painted. I very much love this image that he uses, where the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh or Old Testament, is a palette, but different traditions later, whether Christian traditions or Jewish traditions, create very different pictures from this very same palette. My final observation, much of what I talked about today dealt with polemics between Judaism and Christianity, both on the Jewish and the Christian side. I would again like to state that that is not what I am trying to talk about. I do not want to say that Jews should polemicize against Christians and Christians should polemicize against Jews, but rather each community must celebrate the different potentials, the many potential meanings of the psalm, alongside potential different meanings of verses, such as Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. We must understand how and why the other understands the text differently, and rather than polemicizing, we must grow to greater appreciate the many possibilities that are inherent in the biblical texts in their many languages. Thank you very much.